Hannibal knew that defeating Rome would require more than courage, it would require the impossible. Instead of attacking where Rome was strongest, he chose a route no sane commander would consider. He would march an army across rivers, hostile territories, and the highest mountains in Europe before striking directly into the heart of Italy. It was a gamble that could end in total disaster. Gathering nearly 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and dozens of war elephants, Hannibal assembled one of the most diverse armies the ancient world had ever seen. Veteran African infantry stood alongside fierce Iberian swordsmen. Swift Numidian horsemen, regarded as the finest light cavalry of their age, would become the eyes and ears of his campaign. Different languages echoed through the camps, yet every soldier marched under a single purpose: to bring the war to Rome itself. The first obstacles came quickly. Crossing the Pyrenees, Hannibal encountered resistance from hostile tribes who refused to let a foreign army pass. Every valley became a battlefield, every narrow trail a potential ambush. By the time he reached the Rhone River, thousands of men had already been lost or left behind. Meanwhile, Rome had finally realized the danger. Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio rushed north with an army, expecting to intercept Hannibal before he reached Italy. But when Roman scouts arrived at the Rhone, they found only abandoned campfires and fading footprints. Hannibal had crossed the river with astonishing speed, slipping away before the Romans could even engage him. Then came the greatest challenge of all. The Alps rose before the army like an impenetrable wall of stone and ice. Even Hannibal's own officers questioned whether the march could continue. Snow buried the narrow paths. Sheer cliffs left no room for error. Men and animals slipped into deep ravines, vanishing forever. Mountain tribes attacked from above, hurling rocks onto the struggling column before disappearing into the mist. Hunger became relentless. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and lives. Every mile forward demanded unimaginable sacrifice. Yet Hannibal refused to retreat. Riding among his exhausted soldiers, he reminded them that every step through the mountains brought them closer to the richest lands in Italy, and closer to revenge. After weeks of unimaginable suffering, the impossible happened. The battered survivors finally descended from the Alps into northern Italy. They had lost tens of thousands of men, most of their horses, and many of their elephants. But they had accomplished what Rome believed could never be done. As terrified Roman scouts watched the exhausted army emerge from the mountains, they realized the war had entered Italy itself, and Rome's worst nightmare had just begun. Hannibal knew that defeating Rome would require more than courage, it would require the impossible. Instead of attacking where Rome was strongest, he chose a route no sane commander would consider. He would march an army across rivers, hostile territories, and the highest mountains in Europe before striking directly into the heart of Italy. It was a gamble that could end in total disaster. Gathering nearly 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and dozens of war elephants, Hannibal assembled one of the most diverse armies the ancient world had ever seen. Veteran African infantry stood alongside fierce Iberian swordsmen. Swift Numidian horsemen, regarded as the finest light cavalry of their age, would become the eyes and ears of his campaign. Different languages echoed through the camps, yet every soldier marched under a single purpose: to bring the war to Rome itself. The first obstacles came quickly. Crossing the Pyrenees, Hannibal encountered resistance from hostile tribes who refused to let a foreign army pass. Every valley became a battlefield, every narrow trail a potential ambush. By the time he reached the Rhone River, thousands of men had already been lost or left behind. Meanwhile, Rome had finally realized the danger. Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio rushed north with an army, expecting to intercept Hannibal before he reached Italy. But when Roman scouts arrived at the Rhone, they found only abandoned campfires and fading footprints. Hannibal had crossed the river with astonishing speed, slipping away before the Romans could even engage him. Then came the greatest challenge of all. The Alps rose before the army like an impenetrable wall of stone and ice. Even Hannibal's own officers questioned whether the march could continue. Snow buried the narrow paths. Sheer cliffs left no room for error. Men and animals slipped into deep ravines, vanishing forever. Mountain tribes attacked from above, hurling rocks onto the struggling column before disappearing into the mist. Hunger became relentless. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and lives. Every mile forward demanded unimaginable sacrifice. Yet Hannibal refused to retreat. Riding among his exhausted soldiers, he reminded them that every step through the mountains brought them closer to the richest lands in Italy, and closer to revenge. After weeks of unimaginable suffering, the impossible happened. The battered survivors finally descended from the Alps into northern Italy. They had lost tens of thousands of men, most of their horses, and many of their elephants. But they had accomplished what Rome believed could never be done. As terrified Roman scouts watched the exhausted army emerge from the mountains, they realized the war had entered Italy itself, and Rome's worst nightmare had just begun. The Romans had spent generations fighting wars on distant frontiers. Now, for the first time in living memory, a foreign army stood on Italian soil, led by a commander they had failed to stop before he even reached their homeland. The Senate reacted with confidence. Rome had faced dangerous enemies before, and every one of them had eventually fallen. Hannibal's army was exhausted, outnumbered, and cut off from Carthage. Surely, the invasion would collapse within weeks. Instead, Hannibal struck first. Near the icy banks of the Trebia River in 218 BC, he lured the Roman consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus into exactly the battle he wanted. Hannibal allowed his cavalry to provoke the Romans before retreating across the freezing river. Eager for victory, thousands of Roman soldiers charged after them without eating breakfast, soaked by the icy water and already exhausted before the fighting had truly begun. Hidden nearby was Hannibal's younger brother, Mago, waiting with an elite force concealed in tall grass. As the battle reached its peak, Mago's troops erupted from hiding and crashed into the Roman rear. At the same time, Hannibal's Numidian cavalry overwhelmed the Roman horsemen and attacked from the flanks. The Roman army collapsed into chaos. What should have been Rome's first great victory became its first devastating humiliation. Thousands lay dead on the frozen battlefield, while Hannibal emerged stronger than ever, attracting thousands of Celtic warriors eager to join the man who had defeated the mighty Republic. But Hannibal was only getting started. The following spring, he led his growing army south through the marshlands of Etruria. The journey itself became a nightmare. Soldiers marched for days through waist-deep water. Disease spread rapidly. Horses drowned in the swamps. Hannibal himself suffered a severe eye infection, eventually losing sight in one eye. Yet even half-blind, he continued leading from the front. Then he found the perfect battlefield. On the misty shores of Lake Trasimene, Hannibal prepared one of history's greatest ambushes. Concealing thousands of soldiers among the surrounding hills, he waited patiently as the Roman army marched into the narrow valley below. Thick morning fog hid the Carthaginian positions until it was far too late. Suddenly, horns echoed across the valley. War cries erupted from every direction. Roman soldiers found themselves trapped between the lake and the surrounding hills as Hannibal's forces descended upon them. There was no time to form battle lines. No room to maneuver. Thousands were cut down where they stood, while many others drowned attempting to escape into the lake. By the battle's end, an entire Roman army had been annihilated, and its commander lay among the dead. Panic spread through Rome. For the first time, the Republic feared that Hannibal might truly destroy them. Desperate for survival, the Romans appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator. Refusing to fight Hannibal in open battle, Fabius shadowed the Carthaginian army, cutting supply lines and avoiding direct confrontation. Many Romans mocked his caution, calling him cowardly. They demanded one decisive battle to crush the invader once and for all. So Rome assembled the largest army it had ever raised. Everything would be decided at a place called Cannae. Rome had never assembled a force like this before. Nearly 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry marched toward the dusty plains near the small village of Cannae in 216 BC. It was one of the largest armies the Republic had ever placed in the field. Roman commanders believed victory was no longer a question of strategy, it was a question of overwhelming numbers. Hannibal's army had been worn down by years of campaigning. Outnumbered almost 2-1, he appeared cornered. This was exactly what Hannibal wanted them to believe. Before dawn, he carefully arranged his army in an unusual formation. His strongest African infantry stood back on both flanks, hidden from immediate attention. In the center, he positioned his Celtic and Iberian warriors in a shallow bulging line that pushed forward toward the Romans like the curve of a bow. To the Roman commanders, it looked like weakness. As thousands of legionaries advanced, they smashed into Hannibal's center with incredible force. The Carthaginian line slowly bent backward under the pressure. Roman soldiers cheered as they drove deeper and deeper into what seemed to be a collapsing enemy. Every step forward convinced them that victory was within reach. But the retreat was no accident. Hannibal's center had been trained to give ground deliberately, transforming its outward curve into a deep inward crescent. The Romans, packed tightly together, continued pushing forward, unaware that they were marching into a trap designed long before the battle had begun. Then Hannibal gave the signal. His veteran African infantry, waiting silently on both flanks, wheeled inward like two massive iron doors slamming shut. At the same moment, Hannibal's cavalry, having already crushed the Roman horsemen, charged back onto the battlefield and attacked from behind. Within minutes, the Roman army was surrounded on every side. There was nowhere to run. The tightly packed legionaries could barely lift their swords. Men were crushed against one another as panic spread through the ranks. Those at the rear pushed forward without realizing the soldiers in front had nowhere left to move. The battlefield became a living prison. Hour after hour, Hannibal's soldiers systematically closed the circle. Ancient historians estimated that 50,000 to 70,000 Roman soldiers were killed in a single day, making Cannae one of the deadliest battles in military history. Senators, consuls, veteran officers, and entire generations of Rome's finest fighting men vanished beneath the dust and blood of the battlefield. The defeat was so catastrophic that news of it stunned the Republic. Families waited in silence for loved ones who would never return. Across Italy, many of Rome's allies abandoned their allegiance, convinced that the Republic's collapse was only a matter of time. Even today, military academies around the world study the Battle of Cannae as one of the greatest tactical masterpieces ever executed. Hannibal had achieved what few commanders in history ever could. He had destroyed a vastly larger army through superior planning, discipline, and deception. And yet, after winning the greatest victory of his life, Hannibal made the decision that historians would debate for more than 2,000 years. If Rome had been defeated, why didn't Hannibal simply march on the city? The road to Rome lay open. After Cannae, many of Hannibal's own officers could hardly believe what they had witnessed. According to ancient tradition, his cavalry commander Hannibal approached him with a bold proposal. "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but not how to use one." Whether those exact words were ever spoken remains uncertain, but they captured a question that has echoed through history: why didn't Hannibal march on Rome? The answer was far more complicated than it first appeared. Hannibal had shattered Rome's greatest army, but victory had come at a cost. His own forces had spent years campaigning far from home. Thousands of experienced soldiers had been lost crossing the Alps and fighting across Italy. His army was exhausted, and unlike Rome, he had no endless reserve of manpower to replace them. Most importantly, Hannibal lacked the one thing necessary to capture a city as formidable as Rome: siege equipment. Rome's towering walls were among the strongest in the ancient world. Assaulting them without massive siege towers, battering rams, and a large supply train would have been suicidal. Hannibal had built an army for speed and decisive battles, not for long sieges. Instead, he hoped Rome would collapse from within. His strategy was to convince Rome's allies to abandon the Republic. Every city that defected would weaken Roman resources while strengthening Carthage's position. Some did join him. Capua, one of Italy's richest cities, opened its gates. Several southern Italian communities followed. Even the powerful kingdom of Macedon agreed to support Carthage. But the decisive wave of defections never came. Rome refused to surrender. Rather than negotiate peace, the Senate demonstrated extraordinary resilience. New legions were raised. Slaves were armed. Young boys and old veterans were called into service. Taxes increased, sacrifices were offered to the gods, and every available resource was devoted to one goal: survival. The Republic would fight until there was no one left to fight. While Hannibal waited in southern Italy for reinforcements that rarely arrived, political divisions crippled Carthage. Many leaders feared giving the Barca family too much power and hesitated to send the troops and supplies Hannibal desperately needed. Opportunities slipped away, one after another. Meanwhile, a young Roman commander was quietly rewriting the course of the war. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son of the consul who had once failed to stop Hannibal at the Rhone River. Learning from every Roman defeat, Scipio avoided repeating the mistakes that had destroyed so many armies before him. Instead of chasing Hannibal across Italy, he struck where Carthage was vulnerable. Campaign by campaign, he drove Carthaginian forces out of Spain, cutting off Hannibal's most important source of men, money, and supplies. Then Scipio made an even bolder move. He invaded North Africa itself. For the first time in decades, Carthage faced an enemy at its own gates. With the homeland under direct threat, the Carthaginian Senate had no choice but to recall the one man who had terrified Rome for more than 15 years. Hannibal left Italy undefeated in battle. But the war that had begun with an impossible march across the Alps would now end on the plains of Africa, where two of history's greatest generals were about to meet in one final, decisive confrontation. Scipio Africanus understood something that many Roman commanders before him never had. Hannibal was nearly impossible to defeat on ground of his own choosing. So instead of following him into another deadly trap, Scipio forced Hannibal to fight a battle he could not avoid. In 202 BC, on the plains near the town of Zama in North Africa, the two greatest military minds of their generation finally faced one another. Hannibal, now in his mid-40s, returned home after more than 15 years of campaigning in Italy. His legendary veterans had been reduced in number, replaced by newly recruited soldiers with far less experience. The army that had once crossed the Alps no longer existed. Across the battlefield stood Scipio, a commander who had spent years studying Hannibal's victories. Rather than repeating Rome's old mistakes, he adapted. He learned. And now he intended to use Hannibal's own principles against him. The battle began with one final gamble. Hannibal unleashed nearly 80 war elephants, hoping they would shatter the Roman lines before the infantry even met. Years earlier, such a charge might have caused panic. Scipio was ready. He ordered his legions to form wide corridors between their ranks instead of standing shoulder to shoulder. As the elephants thundered forward, Roman trumpets and horns erupted across the battlefield. Startled by the deafening noise, many of the animals lost control. Some charged harmlessly through the open lanes prepared by the Romans, while others turned back in confusion, crashing into Carthage's own cavalry and throwing Hannibal's army into disorder. The battle was already slipping away. On the wings, Rome's allied Numidian cavalry overwhelmed Hannibal's horsemen and drove them from the field. The infantry fought fiercely in the center, where Hannibal's seasoned veterans resisted with the same discipline that had once destroyed Roman armies at Cannae. For hours, neither side gave way. Then history repeated itself, but this time, against Hannibal. The Roman and Numidian cavalry returned to the battlefield and struck Carthage from behind. Hannibal's soldiers suddenly found themselves trapped between enemies attacking from two directions. The master of encirclement had become the victim of one. The Battle of Zama ended Carthage's hopes of victory. Defeated but still respected, Hannibal escaped the battlefield alive. Carthage surrendered soon afterward, losing its overseas empire, its fleet, and much of its independence. The city that had once challenged Rome for control of the Mediterranean would never recover its former power. Hannibal spent his remaining years in exile, serving as an advisor in foreign kingdoms while Rome continued to pursue him. Refusing to be captured and displayed as a trophy in a Roman triumph, he took poison around 183 BC, ending his own life on his own terms. Ironically, even Rome came to admire the man it had feared for decades. Scipio himself reportedly regarded Hannibal as one of the greatest commanders who had ever lived. Centuries later, generals such as Napoleon Bonaparte, Frederick the Great, and George S. Patton would study his campaigns in search of military brilliance. To this day, the double envelopment at Cannae remains one of the most influential battlefield tactics ever conceived. Hannibal never conquered Rome. He never fulfilled the oath he swore as a child. But for more than 15 years, he forced the greatest republic in the ancient world to fight for its very survival. He proved that genius could overcome overwhelming odds, that courage could challenge an empire, and that a single commander could change the course of history. More than 2,000 years later, the name Hannibal Barca still echoes through military academies, history books, and battlefields of the imagination, not as the man who destroyed Rome, but as the man who came closer than anyone else ever did.